In this video I want to cover the three most basic CSS selectors: type or tag selectors, classes and ID selectors. I feel it's important to do so because even experienced web designers don't always follow the basic principles. This video will also help you understand my approach to working with CSS. Type selector is the official name used by the CSS specification, but Dreamweaver calls it a tag selector, as I suspect many web designers also do. That's because a tag or type selector redefines the basic styles for an HTML element, and the selector is made of the element name without the angle brackets. A type selector styles all matching elements. A class selector has a name that begins with a period, like this float left. It applies to elements that have the class attribute in the opening tag, and it can be used multiple times on the same page. An ID selector has a name that begins with a hashtag or a pound sign. It applies to elements with the same ID attribute and can be used only once on a page. Now let's put all this into practice. This is a completely unstyled page. I've already attached a style sheet, but as you can see, it contains no style rules at all. To start with, let's change the font in the paragraphs. Select a paragraph here and switch to the CSS mode of the property inspector, and I'm going to select a font here. Let's choose Trebuchet MS, and this launches the new CSS rule dialog box. Dreamweaver has analysed my selection and suggests this rather complicated selector, but it's much more efficient to set the font on the body tag to style the whole page. So I'm going to change from compound to tag, and not P, I'm going to use the body. And I want to set the rule definition in my attached style sheet, so select the style sheet there and click OK. And you can see that what has happened is that the font has been applied to the whole page rather than just to a paragraph or to several paragraphs. Next, I'm going to make some changes to the way that the headings look. So I'm going to put my cursor inside the main heading and select it in the tag selector here. And I'll select this align center icon here. And Dreamweaver has again suggested a particular type of selector for me. I don't want it to be wrapper H1. I'll make it less specific. And click OK. And there we are, we've centered the main heading with a rule for H1. But rather than have the same font for the heading, I'd like to have the headings in both a different color and in a different font. If you look down here, the targeted rule is now H1, but I don't want to create it just for H1. I want to affect all of the headings, H1, H2 and H3. So I'll select New CSS Rule, and then I'll change the font to Georgia. Again, going to make it less specific, and then add in H2 and H3. So this grouping selector will affect all three types. So you see that all of the headings are now a different font. And if I change the color here, that same rule has taken in the color, so all the headings are changed at the same time. In the underlying HTML, I've created divs with IDs for main content, wrapper, and also for sidebar. So I need to create some rules for these to move them into different places. If I select div wrapper in the tag selector, and then go to the CSS styles panel, I can click this new CSS rule icon at the bottom here to open the new CSS rule dialog box, and it automatically gives me wrapper. So I click OK, and that opens the CSS rule definition dialog box. And what I'm going to do here is go to the box category and give it a width of 960 pixels. Deselect the same for all checkbox with margin, and make the top margin 0, the right margin auto, the bottom 0, and the left auto. So that will give me a wrapper which is 960 pixels wide, which is centered in the page. Click OK. If I go into full design view and collapse you can see that it's now centered. Let's expand the panels again, and I'm going to put my cursor in here and then select Div Main Content and click New CSS Rule. I don't want it to be within the wrapper. Main content on itself is fine, so less specific, and then click OK to open the CSS Rule definition box and go to Box, Float Right. And when you float something, you need to give it a width, so I'm going to give it a width of 660 pixels and click OK. And what we've done is we've created the main content floating right, and the sidebar has now moved up into the gap that has been created. I just want to give the sidebar a width of its own so that it isn't quite so wide. So div sidebar, new CSS rule. Again, make it less specific. Always use the simplest possible selector to achieve the ends that you want. Now click OK, and I go to the box category and make the width of that 260 pixels. OK, so there we have it. The page is beginning to look a little bit better. I'm now going to insert a couple of images. Put my cursor at the beginning of this paragraph, go to the Insert panel, select Images, go to the Images folder, and select that one. I won't bother to give it any alternate text, you should always do so. And another image down here. Now we need to float the images to the left so that they fit in nicely with the text. Click the new CSS rule icon at the bottom of the CSS Styles panel. Dreamweaver has made a suggestion, but I'm not going to ignore that. And select Class and create a class called Float Left. It doesn't matter whether you put the period at the beginning of the class name in the new CSS rule dialog box. If you leave it out, Dreamweaver will automatically insert it for you. Click OK, and again it's the box category, Float Left. We'll change the margins. We'll give it a top margin of 3, a right margin of 8 pixels, bottom margin of 3, and we want it flush with the left, so we'll make it 0. Click OK, and then I can apply the class to the image that I've got selected by opening the class menu in the property inspector and choosing Float Left, and you see it's floated it quite nicely. Do the same with this one here and float left. So if we just look at that in live view, the page isn't perfect, but it's beginning to look a lot better. And if you look at the CSS styles that I've created, it only uses simple tag selectors or type selectors, an ID selector, and a class.